The jungle moon of Kethris had never known defeat, and neither had the creatures who ruled it. The Varaks were monsters by any measure that mattered, and they were proud of this fact, passing down stories of their conquests through 12,000 years of bloody history that stretched back to before they had names for the stars above them. Each adult Varak stood 7 feet tall at minimum, with the matriarchs reaching heights that would make most species run screaming into the night. And their bodies were covered in scales, the color of polished obsidian that could turn away blades and blaster fire alike. Their claws were legendary throughout the sector. 4 curved hooks on each hand that could punch through starship hulls when they wanted to make a point. And their fangs dripped with a venom that could kill a creature 10 times their size within minutes. They were apex predators on a world filled with apex predators, and they had clawed their way to the top of every food chain they had ever encountered. When the Galactic Concord sent diplomats to discuss membership, the Vorax matriarchs gathered in their great stone hall and laughed until the wall shook, because they saw no reason to join a community of prey animals who had banded together out of weakness. But the Concord ambassadors kept mentioning one species that made the matriarchs curious despite themselves. Humans, they called them, and the way the other species spoke of these creatures was strange and confusing too. Predator minds. The descriptions made no sense at all, because the humans apparently had no claws and no fangs and no venom and no armor of any kind. Just soft pink or brown skin that would tear open if you looked at it wrong. They were small and slow and weak, with flat teeth meant for plants and eyes that could barely see in the dark. High Matriarch Sithara listened to these descriptions with her head tilted to one side, trying to understand the puzzle that had been placed before her, because nothing about these humans made logical sense. How could such pathetic creatures have achieved spaceflight when they should have been eaten by their first predator encounter as infants? And how could they have earned a seat on the Concord Council alongside species that could actually defend themselves? The other matriarchs suggested that humans must breed in enormous numbers to compensate for their weakness, like the swarm insects of the southern jungles that overwhelmed larger prey through sheer volume of bodies. But the Concord diplomats shook their heads and said no. Humans actually bred quite slowly compared to most species, and they invested enormous resources in each individual offspring. This made even less sense, and Sithara found herself unable to stop thinking about the contradiction, so she made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. And she agreed to host a human ambassador on Kethris for a period of 1 standard year so that the Varaks could study this paradox up close. The other matriarchs thought this was an excellent idea, because they assumed the human would provide entertainment and perhaps a lesson in why weakness deserved contempt. The shuttle arrived on a morning when the 3 suns of Kethris aligned in the sky, casting triple shadows across the landing pad where 15 Varak's warriors stood in perfect formation. These were not ordinary warriors, but the elite of the elite, each one having killed at least 100 enemies in personal combat. And they had been chosen specifically to intimidate whoever stepped off that shuttle. They expected the human to freeze in terror at the sight of them, perhaps to collapse or to beg or to try to run back into the shuttle. The door opened and a woman walked out. She was even smaller than the reports had suggested, barely reaching the chest height of the shortest warrior present. And she carried nothing but a simple pack slung over one shoulder. Her hair was dark and pulled back from her face, and her skin was the color of copper in sunlight. And her eyes were brown and calm and completely unafraid. Ambassador Alara Chung looked at the 15 warriors who could have torn her apart in seconds, and she smiled at them like they were old friends she was happy to see. She bowed politely in a way that somehow managed to convey respect without submission, and then she asked in perfectly accented Varax if someone could show her to the fire guest quarters because she was tired from the journey and could use some rest. The warriors did not know what to do with this. They had prepared for fear and submission and perhaps desperate attempts at flattery, but they had not prepared for a creature who treated them like they were helpful staff at a hotel rather than the deadliest beings she had ever encountered. Warrior leader Trix looked at her second in command with confusion in her golden eyes, and her second looked back with equal confusion. And eventually someone remembered that they were supposed to escort the ambassador to her quarters. Alara walked among them, chatting pleasantly about the weather and the beauty of the jungle and how interesting the architecture of the settlement was, and she did not seem to notice or care that any one of her escorts could have killed her with a casual swipe. That night, the matriarchs gathered around the security feeds and watched their guest with intense fascination. The human had been given quarters in the center of the settlement, surrounded by hundreds of Varax who had been told that this creature was to be observed but not harmed. And the door to her room had no lock because the Varax had never needed locks. Alara unpacked her small bag and arranged her belongings neatly, and then lay down on the sleeping platform and closed her eyes. Within minutes she was asleep. The matriarchs watched her vital signs on the medical scanner they had hidden in the room, and they saw something that disturbed them more than they wanted to admit. Her heart rate was slow and steady, and her breathing was deep and regular, and there was no spike of stress hormones in her blood, and her brain patterns showed the peaceful rhythms of genuine restful sleep. She was not pretending to be calm while secretly terrified. She was actually calm. She was actually sleeping peacefully in a compound full of predators who could kill her in 100 different ways, with her door unlocked and her weapons non-existent. And her body had decided that this was a perfectly safe situation. High Matriarch Sithara stared at the screen for a long time after the others had left. Perhaps the human was simply too stupid to understand danger, she told herself, and perhaps tomorrow they would see the fear that should have been there from the beginning. But somewhere deep in her predator brain, in the part that had kept her ancestors alive through millions of years of evolution, a small voice whispered that something was very wrong with this picture. Prey did not sleep soundly in the den of predators unless they did not consider themselves prey at all. 3 weeks passed on the jungle moon of Kethris, and the human ambassador became a fixture that no one quite knew what to do with. Alara Chun walked through the settlement each morning with the same easy confidence she had shown on her first day. Greeting the warriors and workers and merchants she passed as though she had known them for years instead of days. The adults mostly ignored her or watched her with suspicious eyes. But the cubs were a different matter. Entirely young Varax were curious by nature, as all young predators tend to be. And this strange soft creature fascinated them in ways they could not explain. At first they watched her from hiding places behind buildings and trees, their golden eyes tracking her movements as she went about her daily routines. Then one brave cub named Veth decided to get closer. Veth was 12 cycles old and already showed the markings of a future warrior, with scales that gleamed darker than most and claws that were growing sharp and strong. But she was still young enough to feel curiosity more strongly than caution. She crept up behind the human one, Afternoon, and tapped her on the shoulder. Half expecting the creature to scream and run away, Alara turned around and smiled and said hello in the Varax language. And she asked Veth what her name was and how old she was and what she liked to do for fun. No one had ever told Veth that humans were supposed to be afraid of her kind. And so she answered the questions honestly. And soon she was sitting on the ground next to the ambassador, telling her about her favorite games and her annoying siblings and her dreams of becoming a great hunter. Someday other cubs saw this interaction and grew bold themselves. And within a few days, Alara had become the most popular attraction in the settlement. The Human would sit in the central plaza each afternoon, and cubs would gather around her in growing numbers, asking questions about her strange world and her strange body and her strange customs. Alara answered every question with patience and good humor, and she learned all of their names. And she remembered details about their lives that even some of their own mothers forgot. She also brought treats. Her personal rations included things that did not exist on Kethris, and she shared them freely with the cubs who had become her daily companions. Fruit preserves made their eyes go wide with wonder at the concentrated sweetness, and chocolate made their predator tongues twist in confusion because they had never tasted anything like it. The cubs loved these gifts, but more than that, they loved the attention. Alara listened to them in a way that made them feel important, and she praised their small accomplishments, and she remembered their stories from day to day and asked follow-up questions that showed she actually cared. The mothers watched all of this with growing unease. Warrior Mother Crix called a council meeting and stood before the assembled matriarchs with fury in her eyes. She argued that the human was obviously gathering intelligence about their society by targeting the most vulnerable and trusting members, and that allowing this to continue was a security risk that they could not afford. Other mothers agreed with her, pointing out that no prey species had ever behaved this way in the history of Varak's contact with the galaxy. Prey creatures ran from predators or fought them or tried to appease them with submission, but they did not casually befriend the children of their natural enemies. Something was wrong with this human, and the wrongness made the mothers afraid in ways they did not want to admit. But High Matriarch Sithara raised a hand for silence and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of her many years. She had been reading the Concord files on humanity, she said, the secret ones that were not meant for public viewing. And what she had learned kept her awake at night. Humans did not need weapons because they could make weapons from anything, she told the council, and their history was filled with examples of seemingly weak and helpless humans turning everyday objects into instruments of death. A human could kill with a rock or a stick or a piece of broken glass or even just their bare hands if they were determined enough. But that was not what frightened Sithara the most. What frightened her was the pattern she saw in human behavior across 1,000 different worlds and situations. When humans decided that something mattered to them, they became unstoppable, and they would endure any pain and overcome any obstacle and sacrifice anything, including their own lives, to protect what they had chosen to care about. She did not know yet what Alara had decided to care about, but she suspected it had something to do with the cubs who gathered around her each afternoon. The council fell silent at these words, and no one ordered the human removed, and life continued as before. Then the rainy season arrived 3 weeks early. The Varaks had lived on Kethris for 12,000 years, and they knew the rhythms of their world as well as they knew their own heartbeats. So when the sky turned dark and the rain began to fall in sheets that obscured vision beyond a few meters, they knew something was very wrong. The great river that ran through the center of their territory began to swell with terrifying speed, fed by 1,000 streams rushing down from the mountains where the storms had already been raging for hours old. Varaks who remembered previous floods shouted warnings that were lost in the howling wind, and mothers called for their cubs to come inside to safety. But 43 cubs were not in the main settlement. They were at the creche, the nursery compound downstream where young Varaks spent their days, learning and playing under the supervision of 2 young mothers who had not yet earned warrior status. The creche was built in a low area near the river because the water made a pleasant sound, and the cubs enjoyed playing at the edge of the shallows. No one had thought about what would happen if the river stopped being shallow. The flood hit the creche without warning, a wall of brown water and debris that smashed through the flimsy walls and swept away everything in its path. The 2 young mothers barely had time to herd the cubs to the upper platforms before the Lower levels disappeared beneath the churning current. One mother managed to send an emergency signal before the water took out the communications equipment. The message reached the main settlement and spread like fire through dry grass cups. We're trapped in the flooded crash, and water was still rising, and there was no time for rescue boats, and the only way to reach them was to swim through a current that could kill a Varax warrior in seconds. Alara was in her quarters when she heard the screaming begin. The sound that pulled Alara from her quarters was not like anything she had heard before on Kethris. It was the sound of predators in panic, and it was the sound of mothers who believed their children were about to die. And it cut through the howling storm like a blade through flesh. She ran toward the sound without thinking, her small human legs carrying her through mud and rain toward the crowd that had gathered at the edge of the swollen river. What she saw when she arrived made her heart stop for a moment. The great river had become a monster, a churning mass of brown water filled with debris that moved faster than any current she had ever seen. And on the far side, she could barely make out the shape of a building pressed against a rock formation. Even through the rain and the chaos, she could hear the cries of cubs coming from that building. Mothers were everywhere, their massive bodies pacing the bank like caged animals, their golden eyes fixed on the distant creche where their children were trapped. Some had already tried to swim across, and Alara could see their bodies being battered by the current downstream, struggling to reach the shore before they were dragged under. 2 warriors had not made it back up. Warrior Mother Crick stood at the water's edge with water and rain streaming down her scales, and Alara had never seen such helplessness in the eyes of a predator. The Varax were built for strength and power and raw physical dominance, but the river did not care about strength, and their heavy armored bodies became liabilities in the churning water rather than assets. They could not fight this enemy, and they could not kill it, and they could not intimidate it into submission. And so they stood on the shore and watched their cubs drown. Alara pushed through the crowd until she reached the front, and she could see the creche more clearly now. The current had pinned the building against a rock formation in a way that created a temporary air pocket on the upper platforms, and she could see small shapes huddled there, crying and clinging to each other. The water was still rising. She did the math in her head, calculating current speed and distance and the time she had before the water reached those platforms. And she did not like the numbers she came up with, but she also saw something the Varax did not see, because they were not built to read water the way her ancestors had been. The current was not uniform across the river. There were eddies and calm spots where debris had created temporary barriers, and there were places where the flow curved in ways that could be used rather than fought. She stripped off her jacket and kicked off her boots. Crick saw her and grabbed her arm with a grip that could have crushed bone if the warrior had not been careful. The Varax mother looked down at her with something that might have been concern or might have been disbelief. She told Alara that she would die if she entered that water, that she was not built for this, that even Varax warriors were being swept away like leaves in a storm. Alara looked up at the massive predator and she smiled. And it was not a smile of confidence or bravado, but something quieter and more certain. She said that Crix was right, and that the Varax were not built for this, but neither were humans. And that was exactly why she might succeed where they had failed. Crix did not understand, and Alara did not have time to explain. So she pulled her arm free and dove into the water before anyone could stop her. The cold hit her like a fist, and the current grabbed her immediately and tried to drag her downstream. But Alara did not fight it the way the Varax had fought it. She let the water take her for a moment, reading its movements, feeling its rhythms, finding the patterns that her ancestors had learned to find in rivers and oceans across 100,000 years of human history. Her people had crossed the Pacific in boats made of reeds before they had Words for the stars. They had survived ice ages with nothing but fire and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to die. They had walked across continents and swum rivers and climbed mountains that should have killed them. And they had done it not because they were strong, but because they were. Stubborn beyond all reason, Alara found an eddy where the current slowed, and she used it to catch her breath and reassess her path. The debris that had been a danger to the Vorax became stepping stones for her, places to grab and rest for a moment before pushing on. She did not try to swim in a straight line because the current would not allow it. So she swam in a zigzag pattern that let her trade distance for progress. The mothers on the shore watched with wide eyes as the tiny human navigated the river that had defeated their warriors. She moved in ways that made no sense to predator minds, giving up ground to gain ground, seeming to retreat before suddenly surging forward. It took her 15 minutes to cross what would have been a 1-minute swim in calm water. And by the time she reached the crest, her arms were shaking, and her lungs were burning, and her body was covered in bruises from the debris she had bounced off, but she reached it. She pulled herself up onto the platform where 43 cubs huddled in terror, and they stared at her like she was a ghost. The oldest cub was Veth, the same Veth who had first approached her in the settlement. And Veth looked at her with eyes that held a question she was afraid to ask. Alara answered it anyway. She told them that she was here, and that she was going to get them out, and that she needed them to trust her and to do exactly what she said. Veth looked at the churning water that surrounded them, and then looked back at the small, soft creature who had somehow crossed it. And she nodded. They would trust her. They would do what she said. And somewhere on the far shore, High Matriarch Sithara watched the security feed from a surviving camera and saw something she had never expected to see. A human who had decided that Vorax cubs mattered to her. The file warnings echoed in her mind. And for the first time in her long life, she understood what they meant. 43 cubs stared at Alara with huge golden eyes that held more fear than any predator young should ever have to feel. Some of them were barely hatched, no bigger than human toddlers, with scales still soft and claws not yet sharp enough to cut paper. Others were nearly adolescent like Veth, already showing the size and strength that would make them formidable warriors someday. But right now they were just children, trapped in a building that was slowly filling with water. Alara looked at them and made her calculations. Could not carry them all at once because the current was too strong and her body was too small, and the physics simply did not work. She would have to make multiple trips. The thought of going back into that water made her muscles ache with exhaustion she could not afford to show. But there was no other option, and so she pushed the fear away and focused on the problem in front of her. She gathered the cubs around her and spoke to them in a voice that was calm and steady despite the chaos that surrounded them. She told them that she was going to take them to safety, but that she could not take everyone at the same time, and that she needed the bigger cubs to be brave and wait, while she took the smaller ones first. This was hard to say and harder to hear, because the older cubs understood what it meant, and they understood that waiting meant risking being left behind if something went wrong. With stepped forward and asked what she could do to help, and Alara felt her heart swell with something she could not name. She told Veth to keep the others calm and to move everyone to the highest point of the platform and to make sure the smallest cubs did not panic and fall into the water. Veth nodded with a seriousness that made her look older than her 12 cycles. Then Alara tore strips from her clothing and began tying the smallest cubs to her body. She took 6 on the first trip, 3 strapped to her front and 3 to her back, and she slid into the water before she could think too hard about what she was doing. Current hit her like a wall, and the weight of the cubs made everything harder. But she had mapped the river on her first crossing, and she knew where the safe spots were. She talked to the cubs the entire time, telling them stories about Earth, about oceans and rivers, and the silly things human children did when they played. Anything to keep them focused on her voice instead of the water that wanted to swallow them. The mothers on the shore saw her coming and waded out as far as they dared, reaching with their long arms to grab the cubs. As soon as Elara got close enough, 6 cubs were pulled to safety, and Elara turned around and went back. The second trip was harder because her muscles were already tired and the current seemed stronger than before. But she made it to the creche and loaded up 6 more cubs and went back into the water. She made it across. The third trip was when things started to go wrong. The water level had risen and the safe spots she had been using were changing, and she had to improvise on the fly, finding new paths through the chaos while 6 terrified cubs clung to her body. She made it across, but her arms were shaking badly now, and she could not feel her fingers properly. The fourth trip she took 7 cubs because the water was rising faster and she was running out of time. The fifth trip she took 8, pushing her body past limits she did not know she had. And when she reached the shore, she collapsed for a moment before forcing herself back to her feet. Mothers were crying now, not just with fear, but with something else. Something that looked like wonder and disbelief as they watched this tiny soft creature do what their warriors could not. The sixth trip was when the log hit her. She was halfway across with 7 cubs strapped to her body when a submerged piece of debris slammed into her side with the force of a battering ram. She heard something crack and felt pain explode through her chest, and for a moment the world went white and she could not breathe. The cubs screamed and the current tried to drag them all under, and Elara thought about giving up for just a second. Just 1 second of rest. Just 1 moment of peace. But she could hear the cubs crying, and she could see the shore where the mothers were waiting. And she could picture the faces of the 3 cubs still waiting. On the platform she kicked with everything she had left, and she grabbed the debris that had hurt her and used it as a float, and she pulled herself and the 7 cubs through the current inch by agonizing inch. When she reached the shore, she could barely stand, and each breath felt like knives in her chest. But there were still 3 cubs waiting, and she would not leave them behind. The 7th crossing was the longest of her life. Reth was one of the 3 remaining cubs, and she helped Elara tie the 2 smaller ones to the human's body. And then she wrapped her own arms around Elara's neck and held on with all her strength. The river seemed to know that this was its last chance to claim them. The current surged and twisted and threw everything it had at the small group struggling through its waters. And Elara went under once, and then twice, and then a 3rd time. Each time she fought her way back to the surface, spitting water and gasping for air through the fire in her broken ribs. On the 3rd time she went under, she saw darkness closing in around the edges of her vision, and she thought this might be the end. She thought about her grandmother, who had survived a typhoon in the Philippines by holding onto a coconut tree for 16 hours. She thought about her father, who had pulled 3 strangers from a frozen lake in Minnesota when everyone else had given up. She thought about 43 cubs who would live because she had refused to let them die, and she kicked toward the light one more time. They stood on the bank in the rain with their hearts breaking, watching the spot where the human had gone under for the 3rd time, knowing that the river had finally claimed her along with the last 3 cubs. Some of them were already keening the deep mournful sound that Varax made when death came for their young, and others stood in shocked silence, unable to process what they were seeing. Warrior Mother Crix had waded out as far as she dared, her massive body straining against the current, her arms reaching for children she could not save. High Matriarch Sethara stood apart from the others with rain streaming down her ancient scales, And she thought about the human who had done the impossible 7 times, only to fail on the 8th. Then a head broke the surface. Alara erupted from the water, gasping and choking, and somehow still swimming. And 3 cubs clung to her body like they would never let go. The mother screamed and surged toward the water and cricks, lunged forward and grabbed the first cub she could reach and pulled them all toward shore. But Alara could not walk anymore. Her broken ribs had stolen her breath, and her exhausted muscles had finally given out. And when her feet touched the bottom, she simply could not make her legs work. So she crawled. She crawled through the mud and the stones and the shallow water, dragging herself forward with arms that trembled and shook, pulling herself toward the dry land 1 agonizing inch at a time. The 3 cubs would not let go of her, even when the mothers tried to take them. And so they crawled with her, small bodies pressed against hers as she fought for every bit of ground. Mothers waded into the shallows to help, but Alara waved them away. Some instinct telling her that she needed to finish this herself, that the cubs needed to see her make it all the way. She reached the bank and pulled herself up onto dry ground and finally stopped moving. 43 cubs were safe. 43 children who should have drowned in that flood were alive because 1 small soft human had refused to accept their deaths. Alara lay on her, back in the mud with rain falling on her face and 3 cubs still clinging to her. And she laughed, even though it hurt, because they had made it. They had actually made it. The mothers surrounded her then, not in threat, but in something that none of them had words for. These were predators who had spent their entire lives at the top of every food chain they had ever encountered. Creatures of fang and claw and deadly venom who had never needed to feel gratitude toward anyone. But they felt it now. One by one they knelt around the broken human, their massive bodies forming a protective circle to block the wind and rain, their scales pressing close to share what warmth they could. They did not know how to thank her because their language did not have the right words. So they simply stayed close and kept her safe the way she had kept their cubs safe. High Matriarch Sithara pushed through the circle and looked down at Alara with eyes that had seen 12,000 years of Norak's history. She had watched empires rise and fall, had survived wars and plagues and natural disasters that had killed millions, had seen every possible thing that the universe could throw at a species, and had never once been surprised. Until today, she knelt beside the human and looked at her small broken body, at the cuts and bruises that covered her skin, at the way she held her chest to protect her cracked ribs, at the exhaustion that made her limbs shake even as she smiled, and she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since she first read those classified files. Why would you die for them? She asked, when they are not your young and not even your species. Alara looked up at the ancient predator, and her smile grew a little wider. Despite the pain, she said that she had not been dying for them. She had been living for them, and there was a difference. Sithara did not understand at first, but she thought about the words as the rain began to slow and the clouds began to break. Dying for someone was what prey did when predators caught them. A final desperate sacrifice that ended in darkness and silence. But living for someone was different. Living for someone meant getting up when your body wanted to stay down. Meant swimming when the water wanted to drown you. Meant crawling through mud and pain because the alternative was unacceptable. Living for someone meant choosing to endure anything rather than accept their loss. Alara had not thrown herself into that river expecting to die. She had thrown herself into that river absolutely determined to live, because the cubs needed her to live, and that determination had carried her through obstacles that should have killed her a dozen times over. Sithara reached out with one massive clawed hand and very gently touched the human's face. She said that she understood now why the Concord feared humans. Alara shook her head slightly, and said that the Concord did not fear humans. Cythera's eyes held something new then, something that might have been awe or respect, or perhaps the beginning of what humans called love. She said that no, the Concord was wise to fear, but they did not fear humans themselves. They feared what the galaxy became when humans decided something mattered to them. Alara closed her eyes and let the words wash over her, and she thought about the 43 cubs who would grow up to be warriors, who would remember the day a strange soft creature from a distant world had pulled them from a flooded creche one by one. They would tell their own cubs about it someday, and those cubs would tell theirs, and the story would pass down through Varak's history for another 12,000 years. The Varaks joined the Galactic Concord before the year was out. They asked specifically that a human be assigned as permanent liaison to their world, not because they needed protection and not because they needed guidance. They asked because they had learned what it meant to have a human decide that you mattered. Alara stayed on Kethris for the rest of her career, watching the cubs she had saved grow into formidable adults who called her auntie and brought their own children to meet her. And whenever anyone asked the Varaks why they had joined the Concord after refusing for so long, they told the story of the flood and the human. And the 43 cubs, they told the story of the day they learned that the most dangerous thing in the galaxy was not strength or claws or venom. It was a human who had decided you were worth saving, because that human would walk through fire and swim through floods and crawl through pain to bring you home. And that, as it turned out, was worth more than all the claws in the universe.